There are certain nights in television history when the world doesn't just watch, it feels. Nights when the laughter fades, the lights burn a little softer, and silence becomes the most powerful sound of all. This is the story of one of those nights. It began like any other evening on The Tonight Show starring Johnny Carson. The band was playing a jazzy tune, the audience buzzing with anticipation, and Johnny, sharp as ever in his gray suit and red tie, delivered his monologue with the ease of a man who had done it 1,000 times before. The jokes landed. The audience laughed. Everything was routine. But behind the curtain, someone unexpected was waiting. Someone who hadn't been on television in over 20 years. Someone who once meant everything to Johnny Carson and whose sudden appearance that night would bring the world's most confident host to complete silence. The guest wasn't listed on the cue cards. His name wasn't on the show rundown. Even the Rado. Producers didn't know he was there, not until a phone call came through just minutes before airtime. Johnny's longtime assistant whispered the news to him moments before he walked out to start his monologue. His face froze for a split second. Then he nodded, not with fear, but with the weight of memory. He said quietly, "Let him wait." The monologue went as planned, but if you watched closely that night, you'd notice it. The subtle pauses between jokes, the occasional faraway look in Johnny's eyes, the almost imperceptible tightness in his smile. Something was different. By the time the first guest finished their segment, Johnny was unusually quiet. The next guest, a comedian promoting a new film, joked, "Johnny, you're awfully calm tonight. Did somebody tell you a secret?" Johnny smiled politely and said, "You could say that." When the commercial break ended, he turned toward the camera. His tone changed softer, slower. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, "our next moment isn't exactly planned, but sometimes the best moments aren't." The studio audience chuckled lightly, unsure what to expect. The band fell silent. The curtain behind Johnny began to move, and then he saw him. A tall man stepped onto the stage, dressed in a dark blue suit. His hair, once black, was now gray. He walked with a deliberate calm, his expression gentle, his eyes glistening with emotion. The audience gasped. Johnny froze completely. His hand, which had been resting on his desk, dropped slightly. His jaw tightened, and for several seconds, he didn't move. The man walking toward him was James Carson, Johnny's older brother. Few people in America even knew Johnny had a brother. He almost never mentioned him on air. The two had grown apart years earlier, long before Johnny's fame reached its peak. James had been a schoolteacher in Nebraska, living a quiet life, while his younger brother became one of the most recognizable faces in the world. They hadn't spoken in more than 15 years, not because of anger, but because of life's quiet drift that separates even the closest of siblings. But James had come that night for a reason. He was dying. As the realization settled in, the audience, who moments earlier had been clapping politely, began to quiet. The cameras caught Johnny's face, stunned, emotional, utterly unguarded. James reached out his hand and said softly, "Hi, John." That was all it took. Johnny stepped forward, his lips trembling, and the world saw something it never had before. Johnny Carson speechless. The audience was completely still. The band didn't dare play. Johnny looked at his brother for several seconds before finally managing, "Jim, what are you doing here?" James smiled faintly. "I thought it was time we had one more laugh together." A soft wave of emotion moved through the crowd. Johnny took a shaky breath and motioned for his brother to sit beside him. He turned toward the audience. "Folks," he said, his voice breaking, "this is my brother James. I haven't seen him in a very long time." The audience erupted into warm applause, many standing. Johnny didn't hide his tears. He simply sat, staring at his brother, a small, disbelieving smile on his face. Once the applause died down, Johnny asked, "How long have you been planning this?" James chuckled. "Oh, about 20 years. Laughter broke through the tension, and Johnny smiled for real this time. They began talking not as a celebrity and a guest, but as brothers. James told stories from their childhood in Nebraska, how Johnny used to put on magic shows in their backyard for the neighborhood kids, how he'd make fake tickets and charge a nickel per seat. Johnny laughed, remembering. "I forgot all about that," he said. "You were my first audience." James nodded. "And you've had a bigger one ever since." The two talked for several minutes, slipping easily into nostalgia. But beneath the smiles, there was something deeper, the awareness that this was not just a reunion, but a farewell. Johnny leaned back in his chair. "You came all the way here just to surprise me?" James hesitated, then said, "I came to tell you I'm proud of you. I wanted to say it while I still could." the studio fell quiet again. Even the camera operators stopped moving. Johnny looked down, his voice barely audible. "You were always proud of me, Jim. You just never said it." James smiled. "And you were always my little brother, the one who made the whole town laugh." A tear slid down Johnny's cheek. He didn't wipe it away. He reached over, took his brother's hand, and simply held it. For nearly 10 seconds, no one spoke. It was the kind of silence that only truth can create, heavy, real, beautiful. When Johnny finally spoke, his voice cracked. "You've still got great timing. You know that? You always manage to upstage me." The audience laughed softly through their tears. After the break, Johnny turned to the camera again. "Folks, you never know what's going to happen on live television. But this is one of those moments I'll remember for the rest of my life." He looked at his brother. "Thank you for coming." James nodded. "Thank you for keeping us laughing, John. You made home feel a little closer." The band began to play a soft, slow tune, not jazz this time, but something nostalgic, almost like a lullaby. As the show wrapped, Johnny walked his brother backstage. The cameras kept rolling. The producers couldn't bring themselves to cut away. The two men hugged. It wasn't a quick TV-friendly hug. It was long, trembling, real. Johnny whispered something into James's ear, but no microphone picked it up. James just nodded, smiling through his tears. When Johnny returned to the desk, the studio audience gave him a standing ovation. He didn't say a word. He just looked into the camera, gave a small nod, and the screen slowly faded to black. 3 months later, James Carson passed away quietly in his sleep. Johnny never spoke about that night again, but those who knew him said that something changed afterward. He became softer, more reflective. His monologues grew more personal. He laughed a little slower, but when he did, it came from somewhere deeper. Years later, when asked in an interview about the most meaningful moment of his career, Johnny didn't hesitate. He said, "It wasn't a joke, or a guest, or an award. It was a hug." The interviewer asked, "You mean with your brother?" Johnny smiled gently. "Yes." That was the first time I ever realized this show wasn't just about laughter. It was about connection. And sometimes, silence says everything. The footage from that night became one of the most requested clips in the Tonight Show archives. Fans wrote letters saying they'd never seen anything so honest on television. One viewer wrote, "That night reminded me to call my brother. We hadn't spoken in 10 years. Now we talk every week. Thank you for that." Johnny kept that letter in his office for the rest of his career. Even decades later, when reruns aired, that moment still brought audiences to tears. Not because of fame or nostalgia, but because everyone saw themselves in it. The missed chances, the unspoken words, the family ties that stretch across time. When Johnny retired in 1992, his farewell monologue made a quiet reference to that night. He said, "Over the years, I've learned that laughter connects us, but silence reminds us that we belong to one another." He paused, smiled faintly, and added, "Good night, Jim." That was the last time he ever mentioned his brother on camera. When Johnny Carson passed away in 2005, among the keepsakes found in his study was a single-framed photograph. It wasn't of him with presidents or movie stars. It was of that night, Johnny sitting at his desk, his brother's hand resting over his, the two sharing a smile that only brothers understand. At the bottom of the frame, in Johnny's handwriting, were 4 simple words: "Silence was enough."